heart attacks, UTI infections, Jake Sullivan awake for a home invasion attempt at 4 a.m. because he was just up working on a Tuesday night? Is the national security bureaucracy in America unwell? Why are the U.S.'s top national security professionals feeling like they have to work themselves to death? To discuss, I have on today John Gans, a former Pentagon speechwriter who's had many, many other jobs in Washington. He is also the author of the fantastic White House Warriors, a history of the National Security Council. So what is unwell about America's national security bureaucracy?
There's obviously some outliers in the news today. Earlier this fall, General Eric Smith, who is the commandant of the Marine Corps and is a former colleague of mine at the Pentagon, had a heart attack and has since had to have some surgery, as has been publicly announced by the Marine Corps. And, these are examples that are, I guess, bringing up this question of, is working in government bad for your health? And I think these are, heart attacks and prostate cancer probably aren't clearly derived by the day job you have. I mean, there's plenty of people who have both of those conditions that aren't working in the U.S., in Washington and in the U.S. national security bureaucracy. That said, I mean, I think there is a good question of, I think every 4 years we always have the before and after pictures of presidents who looked spry, or at least relatively spry, when they got the job, and look far less spry after 4 years, and even worse after 8 years, right? I think that was, pronounced with Barack Obama, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton. Like this is a gig that, ages you. And same is true of those who are in the shadows, right? In fact, it might be worse because they don't get all the attention. They don't get the great lighting. They don't get the advanced teams. They don't have a staffer making sure they have a peanut butter and jelly, whatever they were pumping Donald Trump out with at the end of his term, just to keep him upright after COVID and everything else. So I think it's one of those ones where these staff jobs are hard. They are, I think, populated by people who drive themselves hard. And these are hard days. And, it takes a toll. As a system, it is not sustainable without a steady influx of new talent, right? Like, it is not like there's a reason national security advisors don't do that job for 20 years. Like, that's, the average tenure is short. There's a reason staff tenure is short. And there is a reason these jobs are going to younger people, right? Like, the staff age, the national security staff age has declined over the course of, I guess now, what is it? We're coming up on 80 years of the National Security Council, has declined because only certain people can do the job. Because your health is one thing. Work-life balance is not even a discussion. But like, if you have a family or you have other things, a wife you're taking care of, a mother you need to visit, if you have kids, like, you can't do these jobs because they are, the need is endless. The demands are endless. And the supply of time you have to do it is limited, right? And so, but these people who are in these jobs are tempted to sit there for 23 hours a day. And they're in some ways rewarded for it.
So let's kind of go through step by step the, types of, the drivers to be in the situation where, not just the National Security Advisor or the Commandant of Marines, but also, the 30-something with a significant other and a small child at home feels, compelled to be working, 18, 19, 20-hour days. We'll start with this one because maybe it's like the simplest, is the sort of sense of importance and the sort of type of person that wants to do this. It was interesting. I was sort of struck with one of the characters in your book. He was at Kennedy's inauguration and Kennedy asks, what can you do for this country? And, you're all inspired and you go into this. I'm like, how would you, we're a long time away from that. We've had, really ugly wars for the past 25 years. Like, what is the type of person in the 21st century who's drawn to these national security positions? And if you could sort of characterize the sense of like why they're in this game in the first place, when there are so many reasons not to be, from a, compensation, like work-life balance perspective, what's the like typical mindset of the person who ends up in one of these incredibly high pressure roles?
So it's good. It's a great question. I wrote this book on the National Security Council staff, and there really isn't a book about the staff, right? There's like a few books about the advisors, and so I like tried to just figure out what the staff was all about, and it was a really interesting experience. And I would go out and talk to people, and I would say, these people, these are human beings, right? These people aren't that different than you or me, except, and this is like the difference, right? They're flesh and blood. They generally have good educations. They generally have, come from enough of a foundation of family or financial support that they could go to a good college, maybe a good post-grad degree, whatever. Like that's a difference maker in the sense of the humanity. But the difference is between them and your average college graduate is, as you point out, the number of people who were inspired to change their lives by the words of one politician in 1961 is shockingly high. Like the number of the people I talked to of a certain generation who are like, well, I listened to John Kennedy and I had to go work in government. It's like they did. And they went and did, things they regretted in many cases. Like, one of them went to Vietnam and like had a horrible experience and like had a massive reaction and changed his life again and became much more of a dove. Another went on to like, put Marines in a position in Beirut where they were blown up at the airport in 1983, right? Like they have made terrible decisions with this, but they are motivated to do this by some reason. And I think there are not a lot of John Kennedy's, and there's certainly not a lot of his inaugural addresses, right? Like that still stands out as one of the best, there is. But there are, every generation, there is something, a spark that like is, a dog whistle that is heard by a certain number of people in the world who say, I have to go do this. And, for me, it was 9/11. I think there's a lot of people in my generation who were 9/11 people. For others, it was, Ronald Reagan tear down this wall, and they hear it and they go. And there is enough of a supply of these folks who want to do this with their lives. And there is an endless demand. Like most people who want to do this, if they go to Washington and give it enough time, they will eventually show up in one of these jobs. It's not like it requires hitting a few marks, having a few educational marks, having enough willingness to endure long days and low pay. And it's not even that low pay. Like you could do okay. Certainly if you're in your 20s and 30s. And wait it out and get, the breaks that you require. But it doesn't require that many breaks to end up on the NSC staff. It doesn't require that many breaks to end up at a congressional office and do ledge that's related to national security. It just doesn't. That is the thing, right? Like there's enough people here who need those young people that they'll take them. And they just work there, and some just stick with it. And I think those are the difference between them is the same difference between your average politician and the president, right? Which is there's enough of a fire burning in them to get to that top room that they'll endure anything to get there. Yeah. And many of them do.
And it's sort of interesting thinking about this in the context of US-China competition, because, it's been this kind of weird, slow burning thing for like 15 years, really. And there are like Alex Wong of Scale AI is like the only prominent young person I've seen speaking like with passion about sort of US-China competition as like a driving force. And, we haven't had a 9/11. We haven't had a sort of JFK inaugural speech. And, I live very much in this world, and like the folks who end up thinking about strategic technology competition, it's a very weird motley crew. Because there hasn't quite been a crystallizing, event or moment. And, way fewer people are studying Chinese than there even were 5 years ago. So anyways, not sure where I'm going with that, but I do want to, sorry.
No, it's interesting though. I mean, it is interesting though, because I will say this, which is like, in some ways, Washington isn't that different than like other towns where there's like a, collection of talented people working. It's probably not that different than Silicon Valley, right? Where you have I'm something about this world, and we're talking on computers, so I'm pointing at a computer, even though obviously that makes no sense to anybody who's watching this or listening to it for sure. But like something about that world connects with them. They hear it and they go, "This is where I want to go," and they land there and they go. Same with Hollywood, right? Like you watch a movie, and something about it, or you watch a show, and something about it captures your like thing, and you go out there and you say, "This is what I want to do," and in most cases, those places will allow you to do it. I think the China stuff is interesting because I think there have been different times in our history where China has done that, right? Like I'm sure, when Henry Luce and co. I'm sure the missionaries early in the century were inspired. I think like China was always, and it's like interesting because I have friends who worked on Russia forever, and it's like that was not hot button either. And so there's always been. So I think I have a friend who works on Russia who has always worked on Russia, and it was like how often was Russia cool, over the last 20, 30 years, right? And he is now like at Foreign Service, and he's like ready, right? Like he's in the space. And so I think China was always, especially over the last 20 years, it was kind of like it was niche. It was big niche, but it was if you were inspired for power, that was probably not where you ran over the last 20 years.
Yeah.
Like it was it was a counter path because everybody who wanted power ran to learn Arabic, serve in Iraq or Afghanistan, and like hit the boxes so they could get there fast. But like China was always one of those ones where it was also harder. Like it's harder. Like it's a lot easier to just go sign up and do 5-year tour, take a hope you get lucky and don't get hurt, and in Iraq or Afghanistan and get your security clearance and go in. Whereas learning Chinese and getting into that country, that's a bigger, harder thing to do.
Yeah. So I want to come back to this, who's in it and what's motivating them, because
Yeah, for sure.
you have this kind of ostensible ethos of the National Security Council, where you have this concept of Washington common law, where these are like the air traffic controllers. They're kind of like getting all the dots in the order, making sure the briefings are presented, all the stakeholders are at the table. But you end up with the people who are on it are the youngest, the hungriest, the most capable. They want to make their stamp in the universe. They want to be in the sequel to your book, right? And you don't get a chapter in White House Warriors if all you're doing is just kind of being a train conductor, right? And there's a really interesting tension there, because I think that is another one of these drivers which leads people to these 18, 19-hour days where, they see themselves as absolutely mission critical. And I'm sure Jake Sullivan believed to the depth of his bones that if he was not working 20-hour days during, the plot in Afghanistan, more people would have gotten out. And if he wasn't staying up all night, talking to Zelensky and artillery manufacturers, like there would be fewer shells that the Ukrainian military could use. And part of that is I'm sure part of that is true, but also there's this sense of like, look, I'm in the pinnacle. Here's my moment. Now's my time to change the shape of world events. And if not me, who?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to tease out a few pieces there. I mean, the common law piece is like, I use that term because, the National Security Council was created in 1947. And the staff, it's a big law, right? The National Security Act of 1947 is massive. But the piece of it is that the staff was created with just one line of law, right? And there's not like the staff will be X, Y, and Z. It is just like there will be a staff. And what happened is that over 60, 70, now almost 80 years, that staff has evolved into being, a creature of the president. Like all of these things were not certain, right? This was like up in the offing. It's just developed as a result of decisions that everybody's kind of reinforced and have accepted, right? Like nobody's lost it. Nobody's gone like, I am going to end this. I'm going to cut this off. There's a few times where the people threatened, but it was always like, the president gets to do what he wants. He's going to get a bunch of people here. Both parties have sort of been okay with it, and it has existed. And as a result, it is like the demand signal is sent. Like we need this number of people every day for a year. I mean, I think, and so you have this like, these billets exist, right? Like what they're called billets in Washington, right? There's just a desk that needs to be staffed and somebody needs to do it. And you get those decisions, you get those assignments. Most people don't get directly hired by the national security. It's not like they have a page that they, career page where you can go and sign up and get there. You usually serve in the military, or you serve in the intelligence community, or you serve in the diplomatic corps, the foreign service, right? And because there's no money that's really spent on the staff, its budget is actually not that much in terms of what's appropriated. They have always just taken people from these different baskets of paid for money. So they've taken stuff from the officer corps of the military, they've taken stuff from the foreign service, they've taken folks from the intelligence community. So they're paid for. And so the way you get those jobs is, and because it's perceived to be a mutual interest between whatever the parent agency is, the military, Marines, whatever, and the White House, they're like, oh, it's in both our interests to have these people serve here. And so it's kind of a plum assignment, right? And so who gets your plum assignments? Your high flyers. Your high flyers then get a 2-year tour, and give a high flyer 2 years and say, this is your tour. And those are basically what you get. You get a year, and then you can usually re-up for a second year, or you get 2 years flat out. And that's your place. And I interviewed a lot of people for the job over the course for the book. And, one of them said, you're like 3 steps from power. It's, the president, it's then the national security advisor, the deputy national security advisor, or whoever your boss is. And sometimes you're closer, right? Like you sit there and you say, how many times do you get to do that? How many times and then you are in a position where you are probably you might not be the deepest expert on China, Afghanistan, AI, but for those 2 years, you have the opportunity to know more about that thing of, what's happening than anybody on the planet, right? Like, you have, because all the information goes to the center, they get to pull information from the embassy, whatever. They have it all, and most of it gets sent to them. They don't even have to fight for it because everybody wants to get their information to the White House. So you're sitting here, you get 2 years, you have all this information, and you are a high flyer. What are you going to do? And it's funny, like I would say this when I would go to talk to people about this book at think tanks. And I was like, you have an incentive to do something with that time. And people would say, why? And I said, in most cases, and in many cases, in almost every American war since World War II, the person that has said, yeah, we should do more, has been a National Security Council staffer. And they have done that. And I've heard from staffers, I've been yelled at by staffers, and they said, I didn't do that. And I'm like, okay, but you could have. Or they would say, I would never do that. And I said, okay, we'll see. Because, I know, like, I haven't served on the staff, so that's, everybody says, we didn't serve on the staff, so you don't know. I'm like, okay, well, I interviewed dozens of staffers. I read lots of stuff. And there's just like, you're there. What are you going to do?
Yeah.
Like, you get to write a memo of the president. Tell him what you think you should do. The incentive is there.
Yeah, you have this great kind of heuristic, which I think you argued pretty compellingly over the course of looking at, post World War II, looking at the history of the NSC, where the NSC, because they have all these information inputs and everyone's trying to feed them the stuff, like they actually do a better job of identifying the problems than a lot of other parts of the bureaucracy.
Yeah.
But because, you're on this short leash, I mean, you only have 2 years, you're this high flyer, you're probably have a general bias towards action. You have this quote, go big when we can. And this sort of flashy big solution where the president gets involved and solves your thing is this institutional bias of being this 30-something who, wants to make their dent in the universe, for a good reason. But there is this kind of interesting that complex that ends up manifesting in these roles.
For sure. I mean, it's the go big one we can. It's that's a quote from an NSC staffer. That's not that is literally quote. And what I'd say about it is, okay, all right, so let's keep going. So the incentive is there. All right. You also are sitting there and you're okay, you're sitting in the backseat of a car and you watching, and you're an NSC, you're a staffer in the NSC. You are not an operator. You are not doing the operation. So I looked at wars because it's the high stakes, right? Like it's like, to me, it's like if they do it at war, they can do it anywhere. And so one of the things is that they are not the general on the ground who's making decisions and sending guys out and women out, and they're not a diplomat in the room doing the negotiation. They're not the operator, nor are they supposed to be, right? When the NSC staff gets in operations, they tend to get in trouble for good reason, because they aren't operators. Like, they don't know the rules of the game, and they're not in that space. So you're sitting there, and they're basically sitting in the backseat of the car. And arguably, they have a better view of what's going on because they have more information coming into them. They're not sitting in the theater, they're not sitting in the war, they're not sitting in the headquarters in Baghdad, sitting in the green zone. They're just sitting at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. They're going to go home that night. They're probably going to get better sleep, have better food. They're going to see something better. So they're great at seeing the problem. Like, they are great at saying, holy mackerel, we're about to hit that car. Or even more kindly, holy mackerel, we're about to miss this turn. So then you say, okay, we've all been in a car where that's happening. Do you jump up and grab the steering wheel? The challenge with it is that when you're sitting at that desk, you feel some sense of the president's responsibility, and it is the president's responsibility, right? The president's job is to grab the steering wheel, right? Like, or at least tell them to turn, order them to. And so these young people feel that sense of responsibility. It's a shared responsibility. It's that's that principal agent component, and they want to grab the steering wheel, and in many cases they have. And I think I take the long view on this, which is American wars since World War II, not a robust showing. I don't think, like, not a really 80 years of statecraft that I think is going to hold up in the history books is like really fine effort. So wars have been, like, a lot of problems. Most of them haven't been great. So lots of opportunity. And they also like, they have great judgment of when something's going wrong, because they can see things, but they have very poor judgment of what to do because they're not doing the things. It's like, it's the classic, like, operator's dilemma. It's like, when I'm cooking something, I'm like in it, but somebody from outside the world can sit here and say, oh man, you're messing this up. But when you're in it, you don't really get it. And you're kind of like, but I'll figure it out. Yeah. And they don't have to have that problem. But because they aren't operating it, they don't have a sense of how to fix it very well. And they've messed up more than they've done well in the prescription business. Let's just put it that way.
So, you mentioned presidents, and one of the things that really struck out to me was your story of the Obama administration in the first year, the decision to whether or not to send more troops to Afghanistan. And,
Mm-hmm.
You have this back and forth where are the generals boxing them in? Is this like, but Obama, he's really trying to do the regular order thing. He's getting all the memos written. Everyone's at the table.
Yeah.
It's this very deliberative discussion. And, he sees all the pros and cons of it. But, like, the crazy thing for me was you had this line where he's like, Obama spent, 25 hours on this. Like, this is an incredibly consequential decision. One of the most important decisions of his presidency. There are billions of dollars, like hundreds of thousands of lives on the line. And 25 hours. And that's just for the big one. It's sort of, I think, we, in the China talk in our audience, like, we spent a lot of time thinking about, national security, foreign policy, but, like, this is at most 20% of the president's time. And of that, your little issue is going to be some fraction of it. And it's just kind of wild that we have this system where there's this executive who's the one that ultimately going to have to make these decisions that has just so little bandwidth. Thoughts, reflections on that? What are the sort of downstream implications of that dynamic, John?
No, I mean, listen, the thing with this stuff is, like, it's hard, right? Like, it's not easy, right? So, I can sort of say it's all been a record, a subpar record, right, over 80 years, but it's not like it was easy, right? So you can kind of get it. Anybody that's done our archival research has these moments where you're able to, like, just capture a moment of, like, what it felt like when you're sitting there. It's like, you're sitting at a nice presidential library, Simi Valley for Reagan, or College Station for Bush, or H.W. Bush, or whatever it is, right? So you're sitting at this like library at this nice desk. You're like going through their files, and like their files kind of exist as they did, right? In most cases, like most people don't really spend a lot of time cleaning their files. And like you go through like Brent Scowcross files from the first days of the sort of what was is the Gulf crisis that became the Desert Shield and then Desert Storm and whatever. And like you go through it and you're like, the number of things going past his desk is just truly shocking. Like, and this is in pre-email era, right? Well, they had email, but like this is in like it was in your face. He didn't have a computer, like for instance. But like, today it must just be like all like just constant, like the amount of information, like bad stuff stacking into your space is truly shocking. So it's like, it's very funny. Like I can't actually tell if you think 25 hours is too much or too little. Like from the perspective of like somebody who's like spent time with the president, that's like trying to understand the president. Like that's a shocking amount of time.
Yeah.
Like it was a shocking number of hours they dedicated to that. And that's just his hours he sat at the sit room table. Like the amount of everybody else's time was shocking. Right. And so it kind of gets to it, but I think it also falls in the category of like, making national security decisions is kind of like planning a wedding, it's like you can plan a wedding for tomorrow.
Yeah.
Right. Like, or you can plan a wedding for 3 years, and the planning will take whatever time you give it because you will just fill the time. So I think there is a degree of this, which is like and he could have probably made that call whatever, like he could have probably made that call at hour 3 and it probably would have turned out about the same way. Yeah. I mean, I think what you do get is that the weirdness of the system is that it is a collection of parts that come together in a rather, it was designed to like let's just get everybody in the room and we'll think it through. Like that was kind of the concept. And it's like, it's not rocket science, but that was like the concept. And to get a bunch of smart people in the room, there's a lot of staff work that goes into it. And then to like accurately track what bunch of smart people decide in a room and then implement it takes a lot of staff time. And so you have this whole operation that is built around trust. And this is the weirdest thing about the system because, you could very easily see, and this has happened before. We've talked about who these people are, super ambitious. They're driven to like make history. They all have streams of information. They all want to have a say. It's like the people at the National Security Council aren't the only ones that want to have a say, right? So does Secretary of Defense. So you have all these super driven people who are super ambitious and are trying to make the most of their moments to make good, like, right, and make history and make their names and make their careers, right? And the only way you can actually get them all to like work together is if they trust each other. And the only way to build trust is to give them a chance to get that say out, right? So like you have to give a smart Secretary of Defense a chance to make his case over and over and over again for you to ever have a chance to say no to him. Because if you're going to say no to him, he has to, because the only way he'll implement your decision is if he, at the end of the day, and I'm using he, but I'm just saying it like it could be a she. The only way they will implement your decision is if they genuinely believe you gave them a chance. Now, like orders and like all these sorts of things, like that happens. And like, that's what's weird about that decision. Because like at the end of the day, Barack Obama said this is an order. And all the people like Bob Gates and everybody else were like, that's fucking weird. Like who gives an order? Right? But like, that's how, and what happened in that system was like the effort to build trust, which was to get everybody in the room and give them a chance, actually led to a distrust that like broke down. And so you had to actually issue a direct order, which is why it was such a bizarre decision.
Yeah.
Right. And so you end up in a situation where like this is all a effort to try and get the best out of smart people. And it tends to, I mean, there are examples of good decisions that were made, but it tends to lead to distrust more times than not. Like, the current administration is unique because they actually haven't broken down into rivals and factions as aggressively as the other ones have, but they all have. I mean, this one will eventually do that because they all do eventually, because that's human nature of the kind of people that end up in these jobs.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. A lot of stuff to pick up on that. 25 hours initially, it seemed to me like not a lot of time. Um, 2.5 days to make the biggest decision of my life. Like I'd want to about a topic like I don't really know a lot about, right? Like I would want more context, and maybe a little more time to breathe. But on the other hand, like what would before that process, if everyone around the room could take odds on what Obama would do, I'm sure the betting favorite would have been, yeah, like send more troops, but like not a ton more troops. Um,
Yeah.
the kind of NSC as a trust building institution that actually oftentimes is counterproductive is a really interesting dynamic. Do like real companies need trust building organizations when the executive makes a decision? Like is there something unique to the national security bureaucracy or America just being this like unwieldy thing?
I think yes. I mean, I think the two things I mean, like you read like the Steve Jobs book, right? Like he, I think, explains like one of the reasons he was a terrible CEO the first time around was he didn't give a shit about what anybody said. Like he was just like, if you can't do it, get out. And it led to, eventually he got thrown out, right? So I think, and then he came around and was, helped develop Tim Cook and other people so there's a piece of this that is, I think everybody needs to do it. I mean, what makes national security different, right? I think one, the financial incentives aren't there, right? So like there isn't the hey, if we all get this together, we can make a lot of money and like you're going to be financially rewarded. I think what is, so that's a piece of it, right? So I think that's one decisive factor, right? I think it is also weird because at the end of the day, like the national security actually is kind of like shielded, right? Like it's like most people don't know who the NSC staffer is working on China. Like, how many people in America know who Kirk Campbell is? Like, I mean, Kirk Campbell is on my dissertation committee. I love Kirk Campbell. Like, he's like a trip. Like, he is like amazing. I wish more people knew who he was because I just think like most people would genuinely get a kick out of Kirk Campbell, and his like he's smart and interesting and challenging and like charming. But how many people know who that is? Like, I guarantee you, most of the people who read my book were like, I have no idea who Megan Sullivan is, but she influenced the biggest national security decision of, certainly of the 20 years of her time, right, on both ends, right? So it's like, it's fascinating. So most people don't know who these people are. So it's not like you're getting famous, right? Like in most cases, like you end up in a book like mine, it's probably not a good thing. So it's not that piece, right? And I think the other thing is that the weird thing about the one thing that is unique about, well, there's a couple of things. War is also like a very uniquely weird thing to like deal with. Like national survival and war is very high stakes. So how do you get people to do this without shutting down, right? Like that's a piece. And then the fourth thing is I think is like everybody has a specific boss, right? And you're trying to like the Defense Department reports, most of it is like uniformed military, and they will be there after the president leaves. They could all sit on their hands for 4 years if they really wanted to. Same is true of this Foreign Service, same is true of the Intelligence Corps, same is true of the rest of the federal bureaucracy, right? And how do you get the best out of people out of the like so-called deep state who's going to be here the day after you get thrown out of office, right? Like you have to convince them to help you. And that's a very unique thing, right? Like, because in theory, like you can fire people in the private sector.
Yeah.
Like like that Steve Jobs did. Like you have a hard time doing that to the U.S. military, right? Like you could maybe get rid of a chairman, but you can't fire every one of them, right? Because eventually you're going to need somebody to do the job, right? So I think that's the other piece of it. Like it is a very weird dynamic, and like the only basis of it, there's only one person in the system who has any reason that they can give an order. It's because a bunch of people in America voted for them. Yeah. Everybody else is like hired by him. Yeah. So it's a little weird. So it's a unique situation in that way.
Yeah, this whole kind of governing by remote control, something that one of your subjects said, was a concept I loved.
Yeah, it was Condi Rice, I think, right? It was Condi Rice. Like she was like, I'm the national security advisor, and if I want to get the U.S. military to do something, I have to kind of hit this button and hope they do it. Hope the channel changes. Like that was her whole thing. And she was like in this interview, like I remember I was doing this interview with her, and I found her like, I found all these characters to be pretty amazing, but she was like very much more like matter of fact, like this is hard on a good day,
Yeah.
right? Like, it's like, and I'm just hoping, and a lot of times the remote control didn't work for her, right? Like Don Rumsfeld didn't let it work.
Yeah. I want to talk about the sort of like organizational evolutionary pressures that have existed on the National Security Council. So, you have this interesting sort of early story. It gets created in 1947. Truman was kind of like not all that into it. And then all of a sudden there's a Korean War. He's like, oh, maybe we should be thinking strategically about the world.
Yeah.
And Eisenhower comes in. His whole deal is like, I want to think double more strategically because like Truman was like a bunch of bums and like we're going to be the real adults in the room. And then you have Kennedy come in and his whole deal was like, oh, these like stodgy old Eisenhower folks, like I'm just going to bring in a few good young Harvard men and we're going to, fix the world. This kind of dynamic of, I guess, like this Kennedy, like Kissinger style, like maverickism and the Eisenhower sort of like institutional, let's like codify and strategize. Can you talk about that kind of spectrum and how it's, done a little bit of seesawing over the course of American history?
The two things I would say is that it was founded by people who served, right? Like it was founded by people who served. Most of them had served in military during one or two world wars, right? So it is a very unique situation. Like this is who founds this thing. And these were when the U.S. government was far different and the presidency was far different, right? This was very much a smaller affair, right? Like today the National Security Council staff sits in the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, which was built to be the State War Navy building or whatever. I always forget the thing, right? And that was because each one, the State Department, the War Department, and the Navy, each had a piece of the building, right? So if you look at the entrances to that building, which is that beautiful building next to the White House, there's like cannons on one, there's anchors on one, and I think there's something else on the state entrance. But they had separate entrances, right? And they all worked in this building, but they didn't all talk that much, right? Like they would just kind of do their thing. They would just, like the State Department did its thing. Like they would send people off to embassies, the War Department. And so they did World War I, and war sort of forced them all to at least talk a little bit more. And what they found was, when we talked, we actually did better. And so they would always be like, the assumption was we just got to get everybody in a room. But getting everybody in a room is not always easy in government because there's not a reward to sit in a room, right? And what happened World War II comes along. They see the British who have get everybody in the room. They have a war cabinet model. Like they had that model. And so there was a precedent that many of them engaged with during the war, especially the military side. Like a lot of people engaged with that. And there was the other thing, which is that Franklin Roosevelt scared him to death because he hated getting everybody in the room. Like he was like, I am a maverick. I am a do whatever it all rests in my hands and I'll do whatever I want to do. And the prevailing thing was many of them served and they came out of World War II scared to death because they were like, this whole thing was run by a old man who was very sick, died unexpectedly, and he did the whole thing lying, cheating, and stealing his way through managing people. He would give people contradictory orders. He would give people the same orders. He would send everybody out, and everybody was driven crazy. And they're like, this is no way to run a war. We have to do better. And so we have to do better inspired probably 50 years of people, right? So you have Truman come in, who's like, I'm an accidental president. The only way I can do this is to corral all of these people. And he kind of did it because the U.S. Senate forced him to do it. And then he saw a little light went off on his team and they said, oh, this is a way to build the White House staff. And so that's what they did. Eisenhower had the same impression, which was like, we have to do better than this. And his reaction was, I want to do military strict order and discipline. Kennedy said, oh, strict order discipline's overrated. I want to go back to the FDR model. Right. And then you had Johnson, who was very much like, he is an Eisenhower, but he was like much more like, let's just have the meetings and we'll go from there. Then you have Nixon come in. It was like, he wanted the FDR model too. Like he was like, I want the power of my hands. It's you have this cycle of these guys who want to be like, and they are guys who wanted to be like Roosevelt, even if they couldn't articulate that. That's what they wanted to be. And like Trump, like was like Roosevelt. Like he wanted it all in his hands. He didn't give a shit about anybody, and he just wanted to do his thing. And so you see that model come back time and time again. And what you find is, it's super attractive, right? And it's especially for politicians who are saying, I got to be an agent of change. It's a fairly easy way to be the agent of change. And then if you're coming in after that, like Joe Biden was not petitioning to be FDR. He was petitioning, well, he was in some ways, but his whole thing was, I want to like return order and discipline.
Yeah.
And so it was much more, there's a way to do this. I know how to do it. And he is much closer to the HW model, who was also like a reaction to much more of a Rooseveltian model, like Reagan. And that's how it works. And it's been that like, wave model of like crazy sort of freelancers and much more sort of process focused folks over the course of the 80 years.
Yeah.
And the system allows it. Like it allows it.
And like, if you think the selection process, you get some weird people being NSC staffers, like just imagine presidents and what kind of complexes like they have. And, you're finally in the White House and it's like, all right, well, I could like have this like weird bureaucracy I don't understand, try to do things, or I could just get on the phone and like figure it out myself. And, you then you have this dynamic where, you have like Obama after that 2009 thing saying like, ooh, maybe I was like a bit too in the weeds here. JFK, the same thing where he, in retrospect, everyone's like, dude, you're being like a desk officer. Like, why are you dealing with all this stuff? But yeah, if you're president and like you got the entire, American national security apparatus at your disposal, like, and you think you can solve a problem, of course, there's like a real temptation to cut through some red tape and make it happen.
Well, I mean, this is like, I go to these, we've all probably sat in lots of meetings where you're like, well, it's just, we got to do a real strategy, or these guys aren't strategic. And you're like, we don't elect strategists. We don't elect international relations scholars. We don't elect people who have probably read half the books on any of your listeners' bookshelves. Like, that's not, we elect politicians and we elect lawyers. Like, that's pretty much who has ended up being president over the last 8 years, right? Like, some, outliers, but, they're mostly, at the end of the day, they're politicians, and that is a unique thing. And politicians are many things, but I don't really think you say a politician is that strategic. I mean, I think a politician is like, I got to do what I got to do to get through, to get enough votes on that day. And if you really think strategy is a piece of it, I think that's probably not how I would describe it. It's like, it's just a pure, it's a tactical thing, right? Like, it's like, I should gotta go out and convince enough people in enough places to do it. And then the lawyers who, that's pretty much how they make their money. I mean, that's pretty much like, Eisenhower's unique, but that describes mostly everybody else, right? Like, Trump isn't a lawyer, but he's a politician. Like, that's who he is. And, he's just, that's his thing. And so we then ask them to do this bizarre high stakes enterprise, and we empower them with all this stuff. Well, that's what's like, I mean, if you recall the transition from Obama to Trump, like one of the things he like walked in and was like, holy shit, there's a lot of people here. Like he like did a little tour with Obama after the election, and he was like, and I guess he like, people were like, he seemed genuinely impressed with like the operation. And then he like came in, and by the end of his term, he had basically totally relegated the NSC staff to like they were basically a ghost ship. And it's like, it just shows you like, we hand them this thing and we're like, oh yeah, this makes sense. This is the rational way to make national decisions. And we hope for the best. I mean, that's what it is. And it's a bizarre thing if you break it down. But it is, I think, one of those ones where we to expect great strategy out of these people is probably an unrealistic dream.
I think also, coming back to like Obama spending 25 hours on this, it's like, great, you have in control of the entire American national bureaucracy, and it's like 15% of your job. It's like half a day, maybe a day a week, you're thinking about foreign policy.
Oh yeah, and let's be clear. And if you are a politician and you are the goal of your first term is to have a second term, and the goal of your second term is not to end up like the worst remembered presidents. Foreign policy really isn't the place you would be like, man, I gotta go give all my time to this thing. I mean, like, Clinton is the perfect example of that, where he's like, nobody ever talked to me about foreign policy the entire time I was running in 1992. Like, why would I exert my time there? And like, foreign policy, made him have to deal with it. But it is truly like, there's no incentive other than avoiding disaster to focus on foreign policy, right? Like, there's, except for like, maybe you want to go on some cool trips, and like, that's your like vision of your presidency, which is getting off the plane and waving and like going through these things. But there's very little incentive for it. Like, there's no reason, like, it's like like Joe Biden is a perfect example. Like, I think he has stressed about, he has put probably as much effort into foreign policy as any president. And do I think that is going to be the reason he gets reelected or not? I don't think so. I don't think that's what the polls suggest. If you look at the polling, foreign policy, unless you count climate change or immigration as like foreign policy issues, which I don't think most people would, it's not even in, it's like not even in the top 10 right now. Like, it's just not what people are voting for. So what's the incentive? And, you got to go to these meetings, and it's like, it is what it is. Like, it's a response. Like, most of them take it seriously, but Donald Trump did. Like, he just decided not to do it. Like, he was like, I'm not going to those meetings, and he didn't go.
So you talked about these two models. We have this like kind of sort of militarized, like regular order common law. We have the Kissinger, Roosevelt, Nixon, Kennedy, Trump, like maverick, like, fuck it, I'm going to do what I want model. Is there a third way? Is this kind of what we're stuck with for the next 75 years?
Do I think there is another model? It's a good question. I think there could be. For sure, right? I think that, what you see is there's probably some evolution, right? Like, I think Reagan started one way and ended another way. I think Clinton started one way and ended another way. Like, there's that kind of piece to it. There is just a tendency towards, like, you're either into this and want to like ride this as a stiff process, or there's like a more freelancing way to do it. And I think that is a basic model of government, that like people can do variations on those themes, but I think it probably breaks down pretty closely to that. Like, you were either part of that process and like believe that this is providing something you don't get otherwise, or you sort of come to believe it's not a thing. And I think a lot of presidents sort of, especially at the end of the term, evolve. And I think Obama is a good example of this, to a much less rigidly structured system, right? Like, it's, and I think you don't have to, right? Because especially at the beginning of your term, you have to get all these people on the same page. That's less true at the end, because you can assert more authority with hiring and appointments and everything else. So you can evolve a little bit.
You mentioned earlier that the U.S. had the UK war cabinet to model. I've read a number of stories that now the kind of NSC as a concept, we had Japan standing up its own version. I think the Blue House in Korea has one. There's even been some articles about
India,
about
India.
China of Xi wanting his own kind of like NSC type organization. Any thoughts on the kind of internationalization of this model, or if there are other models that other countries in the world have tried over the past few decades?
No, I think so. I think in terms of this export, this like franchisee model of National Security Councils, like, I think it's kind of funny because I think India's done one. I think there's a couple different models. And I think it's like, it becomes like, it's like a very good example. Like, the National Security Advisor is not the title of the National Security Advisor job, right? It's the Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, whatever. Like, that's the title. And that's never been the job title, right? Like, it's like Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that's a job title. President's a job title. National Security Advisor is like a nickname kind of thing, right? Like, it's like the kind of, and like, it came about because, like, I think Lyndon B. Johnson's guy, I think, kind of liked it and kind of thought it sounded important. And like, there was a demand for somebody that sounded important. So he just started calling it the National Security Advisor. And that's how that's like why we still have it. Yeah. So I think like I'm sure in capitals everywhere, there are people who are like, we need a national security council. We need a national security, like there's like just a demand for it. I think also like in protocol, it sort of makes sense, right? Like they have a national security advisor. We should have a national security, like things. But I think like, the thing that hasn't happened that is unique, as I understand it, few have ever done the staff the way that we have done the staff, right? And that's partly probably driven by the sort of like parliamentary nature of most of these places, right? They are like the president can go, the prime minister can go tomorrow, right? And so there's not like the massive staff at these places. Like I think the cabinet office has like a pretty decent size up, but nobody has. The National Security Council staff has probably like something like 400 people on it today. Like that's a massive amount of people. Yeah. I mean that's a big load of people, and I mean a lot of that's technical, keeping the lights on, keeping this call secure. That's a massive operation, and most of them haven't done that. The other models out there, I mean, I think there's the Saddam Hussein, right? Like which is like me, my sons, the Gaddafi model, and like a few generals who are loyal enough not to kill me. That's a model that I think we have, maybe we'll try sometime soon. I have no idea. And then I think there is like the far more, but I think like in China, I think you see, and I'm not a China, I've done my basic work, but I'm not a China scholar, but like I think you see a much more traditional model, right? And I think that's one of the frustrations, as I understand it, with some of the Chinese foreign policy, which is like, it is much more subject to corruption. It's much more subject to breakdown because you have the PLA does its thing, PLN does its thing, the diplomats do their thing. And sure, we all come together in different settings, but like it's harder to get those organizations to agree to things. And that table allows you to do it, but I don't think anybody's doing the staff the way we've done it.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's clear that in the 20th and 21st century, there is a kind of like global impetus to want to have your different branches of the military and, your diplomatic corps, like be able to listen and digest what your executive is saying and have that kind of filter in a way where it's not like, Japan in 1941, where you just have like the army over here and the navy over there. And then you have like the emperor and the prime minister. And it's just this big mess, like having some sort of structure where your meetings happen, and some staff to like help make that flow seems like a thing which is going to happen regardless if you're trying to kind of like compete at a, in a global way and like at the speed at which, conflicts happen in the 21st century.
What's funny about it is like the proliferation of a questionable model, right? Like, which is like, I mean, say what you want about like, Churchill was Churchill and sure we won the war, but like the proliferation of the UK, model to the United States is kind of a trip, right? Like, cause it's not like they were managing the empire particularly well, right? Like the empire at the end of the war, not exactly. It's like the export of McDonald's food. It's like, everybody wants it, but nobody realizes it's terrible for you. It's like someone's like, you're welcome for your supersized Big Mac. It's really not that nutritious. Yeah. But you can also have a National Security Council, despite its track record.
Yeah. So that's kind of the evolutionary pressure question that I want to get back to you. Is like, look,
sure,
the U.S. looks great because we're really big and we're really rich, and we came out of the Cold War on top, and regardless of all of the sort of missteps that you pointed to in your book of the National Security Council, screwing up Lebanon and like screwing up Iraq and screwing up Afghanistan and screwing up Vietnam, like at the end of the day, like America's still here and still the largest, richest, most powerful country in the world. So it's interesting because that is the case, like there haven't the sort of evolutionary pressures that have been put on the NSC and the national security bureaucracy and generally as like an organization have, as you said, like kind of come because the new president is a little frustrated with the style of the other president that came before them. Not like, you have 10 handset manufacturers and they're all trying to make different cell phones and like you're going to get the best one at the end. Like you're not running sort of parallel experiments. Like there's much less actual, evolutionary happening, and you end up with this common law, which like may just not be the fittest version of national security decision making from a like national power maximization, global happiness perspective, but like it's the one we're stuck with. And I'm sitting here talking to the historian who's written a book about it, who can't come up with any good ideas of how to do it differently.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say about it is I think the two things I'd say about it is like, is there like an alternative universe America that like post World War II did create a National Security Council, and is it have a different, like, do we end up in different places? So that's a good question. Like as a thought experiment, like, do you end up in a different place? My suspicion is that if the presidency itself was less empowered, you would have gone to far fewer wars. Like I do genuinely believe that. Like I just think the wars are the answer to a problem because there aren't that many answers to hard problems. So I do think, like, do I think Vietnam would have happened or persisted? Do I think Afghanistan would have persisted as long? No. If you didn't have a national security, I do not think so. Like, I just don't think that's true. Like, if you look at the frustration over the last 20 something years with wars, like if you look at, the election in 2004, like, people were not happy with war in 2004, right? Like around Iraq. And they were furious in 2006. What did they get after 2006? Surge in Iraq. They didn't get the hell out of Iraq. You got that. You elected an anti-war president like in Barack Obama, and you got a surge in Afghanistan and an 8-year war. You elect Donald Trump, who literally said, "I'm getting out," and he was in all the way through, right? So it's like the system does not react to what the public wants, and it probably doesn't really always react to what the bureaucracy would do. So I think there's an alternative user where I do believe that. In terms of like, I do think, listen, the NSC exists because, like, for lack of a better idea, right? And like, no, lots of things in the United States and our government exist because, disaster hasn't struck yet, right? Like, because, there's no real other way to operate because this is how we know how to operate. Like, it's the same way, I'm sure that's how it goes. That said, I mean, I'm of the opinion, like, if we have a president, that person is going to want some people around to help them, and they're probably going to want to get everybody in a room. My own view on like what you could do differently, I think that the NSC would focus less on, and the president could focus less on, like, they have to pick the right size issues that they focus on. Like, they're going to focus on things the same way because they're like, this is who we elect, right? Like, they're going to be ambitious people who are probably not natural. Like, Barack Obama was an international relations major, but I don't think everybody, and it's not what he worked on. He didn't serve the military, like, did a lot of things. He was a lawyer. So I think it's one of those ones where you're going to elect a certain number of people, they're going to want a certain number of things. The thing that I think they tend to there's a certain size issue they can just let go to the other parts of the bureaucracy. And I don't think the decision to work on all of it is totally I don't think it's good for everybody. Like, I just think they need to find the right size issues. And like, I think I talk about grand strategy is where the president should be. Right? Like, I don't like the term grand strategy because I don't think it's like terrible, but like that makes sense for a president, right? Because like it does get into the things the president cares about, like domestic stuff and all those sorts of things. But they tend to like be up all night dealing with weapons manufacturers. And like, that really should not be the job of a national security advisor or a national security staffer. It's like that's not a good place to be. Yeah. And it's not in their interest. That's what's bizarre. Because at the end of the day, if you want to make a decision that outlasts your term, don't put it to National Security Council. Put it in the bureaucracy because that stays. Pass it in law because that stays.
And I think this is kind of where we come back to like what's broken and unwell is that if the sort of gears of decision and action are such that you need Jake Sullivan at night making calls at 3 a.m. to artillery manufacturers, like, this is kind of the same story with Bob Gates and the MRAPs, right? It's like, maybe there's a bit of a savior complex going on, but I'm sure there's still a dynamic where, you get extra juice in the gears of these things if you have the most senior person yelling and screaming about topic X. No?
I think to some extent. I mean, But I also think this is one of these things where it's like, what is the goal, right? If you're president or you're whatever, like, what is the goal? And I think this does get into like how you think about government and how you think about like effective policy. Now you think about foreign policy, which is like, what is the goal? Which is like, I think if you think about government as like and foreign policies, I am just gonna make sure the world doesn't end on my watch, and that like the worst doesn't happen. I think you do run into a position where you're just preventing that all the time, and it's like, it's kind of like, I don't know. I have kids who are young, who are threatening to come in here at any minute, but like you can very easily take a job of being a parent of like, I'm just gonna avoid them falling and crying and doing all those sorts of things. If that's the goal, right? Like that's a certain model of parenting, but like that's not probably what you should be doing, right? Like that's not growing a functional, smart, confident kid, right? Like I think if your goal of affecting change is your goal, and like making changing American foreign policy, like you wouldn't have it happening at the White House beyond a certain point. Like it has to go beyond that. Sustainability is the path to success. And honestly, sustainability is the path to like history. And like, that's the funny thing that like, and I don't know if it's Hollywood, I don't know if it's the way books are written, but like that incentive that we talked about earlier, like to like speak up and go big when you can, like if you really want to have a big impact, it's like, passing a law that's hard to overturn, like finding enough common ground to get, Republicans and Democrats to do something. It's building a model in the U.S. military that like around, it's very funny. Like there was an old story about a military commander, and the scholar was like, why have you changed the uniform so often? Like during the Cold War on terror. And the military person like looked at him was like, it's the thing I can change on my own. I don't have to ask anybody for permission. Right. And it's like, there is pieces that like, there's fast ways to make change and there's slow ways to make change. And the incentives are not towards the slow ways, but that is where the real change happens.
You have this one paragraph in your Kissinger chapter where
we couldn't get through this without talking about Kissinger. Yes. Like he had to come up.
So there's some NSC staffer who ends up doing all of the kind of technical grunt work to get the State Department to sign a new resolution around banning chemical and biological weapons. The paper gets put in front of Kissinger, and he goes, I can't read this paper, let alone understand the issues. But was like, yeah, sure, seems about right. Why not? And it's interesting because like the things that the principals and the president tend to gravitate towards are the ones where they think they can understand, right? Like you got this famous story of Biden and Obama going into the weeds on the evidence of whether or not Osama is in the building in Abbottabad, because they're like, oh, like, I'm a smart person, like I can weigh this stuff, but like, are they doing the same thing when it comes to the thresholds around, export controls for semiconductors? Like probably not, because it's just this specific technical, very nuanced thing where you can probably get a lot further, even though it's not, necessarily the sexiest issue of War and Peace.
Yeah, well, that Kissinger story is always one of my favorites because I interviewed a lot of people who were like work for Kissinger, and working for Henry Kissinger is like, I assume being married to like just some sort of like it's a time in your life when you went through something wild, and most of them had like horrible experiences, but some people loved it, right? Like, and what like was there anything rewarding? And they would all point to that chemical weapons. They're like, man, that was a really profound policy that got done, and it was pretty much got done because like it just didn't rise to the level of something that interested him enough to have an opinion. I mean, like, or that he could understand it, right? So it's like one of those ones where it's a good example, but it's like funny because this is like you would talk to people during the Trump years, and like I had NSC staffers like reaching out to me like anonymously to talk to me about how bad the NSC staff, but like you would talk to people in government, and like, if it was a small enough issue, they were like, it's totally great work for Trump. Like he doesn't really care. Like just kind of go along. We're going to get this done. Like, we work on this little thing in the South Pacific, or we work on this little thing in the Arctic. Like, he doesn't care. He cares about like the big 3 or 4 things, and like everything else is just kind of like go along, go along. The difference is that when he basically just decided that he was going to go to war against all of them, that's when they all got worried, and that's when they all started leaking like crazy to me and others, because they were just like, this is getting out of hand. I mean, and he basically decided that none of that stuff even mattered enough to have the system. Like, he was just like, I'm so annoyed with this, I'm just going to get rid of it.
Yeah.
But it's one of those things where, presidents care about certain numbers of things, and certain numbers of things show up on their radar, and mostly because they're put there by their counterparts, the press, the American people, like, care about like enough of a thing that they actually kind of start to engage on it.
John, you talk a little bit about how technology's changed the NSC. You alluded earlier to like email being a thing all of a sudden. What else over the course of the 80-year history, from a technological evolution perspective, has changed how this job gets done?
We can sort of track the NSC's power through the different evolutions. So, like Kennedy, like they'd put telegraph wires through to help Roosevelt do his, what he called juggling, right? And so they existed. And so after the Bad Pigs, Kennedy was like, I need more of the raw stuff. I think it was there, quote, like, I wanted the raw intel. Like, I don't want to get everything. And so they basically just reactivated the wires. That became the sit room. Like, became what it was. Like, the sit room didn't exist. Kennedy built the sit room. Like, there was always kind of rooms, but that became it. And so that was a technological revolution. And then everybody was gaming that system because they realized if they put certain words in their messages, they would go right to the White House versus not. Like, and so everybody was like saying like most important or high importance or something like that. So yeah, that one. You have email shows up in the Reagan years, right? So you have that, like, where they pull that in after his assassination attempt. So it's always after bad stuff. Assassination attempt, they pull that in. Then you have obviously Blackberries, and like that's where an email really takes off in the 90s. That's where the archives become basically impossible, because it's just the email traffic alone is insane. Like, you can't track it. The big one that people don't realize is, like, it's kind of funny now that like we're sitting here on a system that allows us to talk from one place to another with a video and everything else, right? Is the NSC at around the time of Reagan, when they redid the sit room after the assassination attempt, they brought in video teleconferencing. And so that became a thing where you could be sitting at the Pentagon or sitting in an embassy, and if you had the tech, you could do video teleconference. I think the speeding of how many people got access to that was far higher in the U.S. government than it was outside. Like, what was the Tandberg machine, which is a separate unit in your office where you could basically dial a number and have a video teleconference with people. The Pentagon people would do it within the Pentagon, right? Because long walk, you could just do it to the White House, you could do it to the embassy, and like certain offices had these Tandberg machines. And that was a huge alteration, because especially during the wars of Iraq and Afghanistan, people would feel like they were in it, right? Like, they're talking all hours. They could talk to the general on the ground or his staff at all hours, and they felt like they were in it, but they were not. They were sitting at the old executive office building and going home to their apartment in Georgetown or Arlington or their house in Chevy Chase, and they were able to do this. And so what you see is that along the way, this technology has empowered the staff in new ways, right? Because all of that is about pulling information into that one place. And, listen, emails, like, I worked in the government, like, emails from the White House, Tandbergs from the White House, phone calls from the White House get returned first in most cases, because that's, the big boss, right? Like, that's what you want to do. That's where the center of the power is. And so it is one of those ones where, like, when the White House calls, you answer. And so this technology has always empowered the White House every single time.
This kind of comes back to your hypothetical, right? Of like, could you imagine a second half of the 20th century where you don't have an empowered executive? I mean, like, maybe like FDR loses in 1944 and there's this big kind of like backlash, or like you don't fight the Cold War or something. But I feel like there are so many other trends that would lead you in favor to a more empowered executive that it's hard for me to like, from the technology perspective, I don't know, it's hard to kind of back out.
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, here's a good example. I think, the presidency is what it is, right? Like, it is kind of a thing, right? So it's like there was always going to be that, right? And as you grew the government, which you did post-depression on the domestic side and post-World War II during World War II, and then, post-World War, Pearl Harbor, we'll say, on the foreign policy side, you were always going to have a strong executive, right? Like, it was just going to happen. So the question, okay, so here's the question, though, that I think is a more interesting question, which is, even when there's a failure of the White House, and even when there's a failure of the executive, right, why is there not an effort to disempower them? So you have, let's go through Bay Pigs, probably not like massive failure, right? Like Bay Pigs bad, but like not a massive failure. Watergate, right? Like, why didn't, listen, the wiretapping started on the NSC. Those were the first folks who were wiretapped. Why did the NSC continue to exist? Okay, Iran-Contra. Nothing. They did nothing.
Yeah.
Donald Trump. George W. Bush. All right, so we say Iraq. Like, massive misfire. Perhaps the greatest example of misleadership by an executive in war in the United States in a long time, if ever. Nothing happens to change the system. Donald Trump, who literally is like, at this moment, at least in contention to be president, and showed like genuine, like not only a incapacity for it, but a disbelief in its actual usefulness, let alone its rightness, is nothing changed. Like, literally nothing has changed. Like, there has never been a move on the NSC. Never been a move to really disempower the presidency. And that is the most bizarre thing to me, because you have examples of missteps. And the assumption is it'll be better. People will learn. But the real story is, I might get in there someday. Not necessarily as being president, but like my guy might, my team might, or especially in the national security establishment, for whatever that means anymore, I could be in there someday. So why would I ever call for it to be a weaker office? There's just no reason to.
The kind of, one of the wild lines that feels so anachronistic in your book was Reagan saying, well, Ike never had to be worried about getting impeached under the War Powers Act, which just sounds like such a ridiculously, in hindsight, an anachronistic thing. It's like, this guy did Iran-Contra, this guy totally fucked up Lebanon, and then, you write about this like after action report of the Reagan NSC, and they're like, like maybe we should give it more power. Maybe that was another inflection point. If you didn't have HW, who was, this traditionalist who's been in the system his entire life, who was, never really going to change all that much from a bureaucratic perspective. The end of the Cold War felt like it might have been that moment. And
for sure,
Trump also, maybe if you had a kind of like come to Jesus with it, but the Ukraine stuff, people forget about that. The fucking first impeachment like how wild
it was all foreign policy. It was all foreign policy. Yeah, it's interesting. It's fascinating. I compared it to Iran-Contra, and it was very interesting. it was like, the fights amongst the resistance, for lack of a better term, right? Of like, everybody would be like, oh, I disagree. It's not like Iran-Contra. And you're like, okay, what are we talking about here? Like, we're literally like, it's bad. This is at least a way to conceptualize it. Like, what are we talking about? And like, you'd have like, you'd have like one of these blowhards come in and be like, with like their massive Twitter followings, and be like, it has nothing to do with foreign policy. This is just baseline corruption. I'm like, no, dude, it's like a basic foreign policy corruption scandal. Like, that's what it was, right? And everybody tries to assume it's like some bigger thing. And you're like, no, you just misused the U.S. government's capacities for his own gain. It was about his gain, not whatever a policy perspective, but whatever. But the point of the story is that, it's fascinating to me. Like, Brent Scowcroft too. It's very funny. Like, who is the best? Like, I always get asked to like, who's the best national security advisor or whatever. Like, that's like an interesting conversation amongst like nerds. And I'm often at those tables, and they're like, hey, it's like clearly Brent Scowcroft. Like, Brent Scowcroft was the only one that's done it twice, so he sort of had that experience, and sort of he was best friends were close with the president. He was pretty good at it. He was good. But like, nobody is more responsible for the saving of this system than Brent Scowcroft, because he was put on the Tower Board that investigated Iran-Contra, and it was pretty much him and his writer, Steve Hadley, who wrote the report, who saved the National Security Council in 1985, 86, 87. It would not surely exist in the same function, except for those two who did it. And they went out of their way to do it because they didn't see any other way. Probably because I think Scowcroft, yeah, I'm sure there's some self-interest in it. They were both products of it, and they thought it was important. But it is fascinating. I mean, I don't, it is a weird thing because, there's rational pieces of this that you would expect people would react to, and they just don't. They just don't. And I don't, it's fascinating. I ask hard questions about staff, and, I have always found more people are like, oh, it's bizarre that people don't ask hard questions about the government. I just find it bizarre. But the not really revising it after the Cold War is kind of fascinating. And I know the crises came fast and hot, with Panama and Iraq. But Richard Haas is probably another one who saved the NSC because, that Gulf War was if you look at, until around 2003, you say, okay, that was really a remarkable operation that went well, that had a limit, and all those things. But we might not have gone to war if Richard Haas hadn't been working on the NSC in August of 1990, right? That might not have been how it went. I tell that story. That story is fascinating. I don't think many people know that how deeply and late General Powell, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, basically didn't want to go to war. And Richard Haas, Bob Gates, who was the Deputy National Security Advisor, Brent Scowcroft, along with H.W. Bush, came up with the idea of an ultimatum that they gave. And listen, Brent, General Powell didn't want to do it, at all. And they basically wrote, I tell this great story about finding a note from the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who wrote a note and wrote up top, and I forget exactly the direct quote, but it's tell your supreme leader that this idea is basically tantamount to going to war or something like that. That's a paraphrase. And it was literally at the top of a response to a memo. And I sat with this vice chairman, and I was sitting with him, interviewing him in his office, at his home, and he would tell people over the years, it was one of the best decisions we ever made. And well, you opposed it. And he was wow. And it became very clear. He's well, I obviously don't remember. He said, he broke down. He's I obviously don't remember opposing it. And it was because it had gone well. It's kind of amazing. But that is probably one of the reasons we have an NSC today. It's because those guys proved it could work. And a few women were on that NSC.
What's the power ranking of how good the staff work has seemed to you from the presidential archive?
I would say two things I would say is you would, one thing is true, which is that it is remarkably most people would probably feel pretty better about their government if they read any of this stuff, because you're it's pretty smart. People try, it's done. The second thing is I think it's remarkably consistent.
Interesting.
That's another thing that would probably surprise you. It's not there were illiterates running around on, certain NSCs. I mean, there's a pretty standard pedigree of what an NSC staffer is over 80 years. It's a white, Harvard, Ivy League educated, mostly men, but a lot of women, overeducated person who has read foreign affairs more than they probably should. And that's pretty much what the writing. If you're ChatGPT, write a National Security Council memorandum in the voice of a white, overeducated foreign affairs subscriber, you would probably get 90% of what comes out of these documents. That said, what I would say the stuff I hated reading was I hated reading the Nixon stuff. You could feel the psychodrama in the pages. And part of that is memory, but reading Kissinger stuff is and listening to the transcripts of the calls and reading them, you're these are the worst people. You would just these two human beings ran into each other in the time space of history. and created such mayhem. And it's like truly bananas, like like those two dark forces arrived in the same place and time and decided, let's go put on a show together. It's like bizarre. Like, I mean, it was like totally irrational and wrought terror around the world, right? Like, sure, made some good decisions, but like some really bad things came out of it, including like they wiretapped guys who were his old friends. Like he was wiretapping friends he worked with at Harvard. So it's like I could go on forever. So who did I like? I mean, like, listen, like, the Kennedy guys had charm and wit, right? Like, you could see it in the page. Like, you could feel it. Like, so you're like, oh, these guys, would I want them to, like, set up a war in Southeast Asia? No, but I'd probably like to have a scotch for, like, 90% of the NSC of Kennedy. And, like, I would love to sit around the fireplace and watch him rock in his rocking chair, and it'd be fun. Like, that seems like fun. I mean, there was definitely, like, just... I think how well read everybody was in that era versus how well read they are today, I think the writing has gotten a little more stilted. But also, I'm a strong believer that like very few great American speeches have been written in the word processor era, because there's something to be said for typing on a typewriter. There's also something to be said for most of them had secretaries who were typing that stuff for them, and they were really good writers and very smart and like fixed errors and that kind of stuff. So the stuff was better. And back then, because they were saying it out loud, somebody was distilling it, they would then rewrite it, and it would be done on a new piece of paper. It wasn't deleting, it wasn't tweaking around the margins. It's like why whenever I have to write an op-ed, I write it, I print it out, and I rewrite it on a blank sheet of paper. So I'm like, that's how you get to condensing your thoughts. But they were great. So I mean, I would read any of that stuff 9 times out of 10. Like the memos of Richard Neustadt, who gave Kennedy memos on setting up his presidency. There's a book that compiles them all. They're like jaunty, punchy. Like this is like he gave him basically permission to be Roosevelt, and his memos are just awesome. Like it, and really amazing. And that was a generation that knew how to write and could write in ways that today's not as great at it. But that doesn't make it bad or worse.
What do you think like Word documents and track changes has done for the national security
bureaucracy? Oh, it's the worst. I mean, I could say it's like somebody who worked in government and wrote speeches in government in the track changes era. Like you send these out, and it's like people just destroy them, and it's like, and it just becomes impossible. And listen, like there's like, so like the speeches, it's like misery. Like it's like, oh, this is terrible. I mean, I remember like some guy who went to grad school with me called me, and I hadn't heard from him in like 5 years. He said, I just read the draft of the speech, because when I worked in government, the Secretary of Defense I wrote speeches for demanded that we put our names at the top and our phone numbers so they could call us if he ever had a beef. And so like then they would go out into the bureaucracy, like, and somebody like Homeland Security picked up the phone and was like, the John Gans I took whatever class with would never have written this. And I said, what the fuck? What are you doing here, dude? And he was like, we have crossed this out. I'm like, great, well, I'll just rewrite it again. But like whatever we want to do. So I think like generally like not a net positive. I think it's really hard to write cohesive thoughts. Like there's like a strategic piece here. Like one of the things, like I interviewed Cheney, which was a trip, and I interviewed Rumsfeld. And listen, like lots of differences of opinion with those. Speaking of dark forces that united at a unique moment in history. But they do have a really interesting point about strategy, and they did connect it to word processing and everything. But their basic thing is it's very hard to do strategy in government. And there is a tendency towards basically saying, well, I'll just take all these ideas and we'll call it a strategy, instead of having a true classic strategy that is pure and consistent and has a through line. And their basic argument is there's a tendency just to take all, they wouldn't put it this way, but to basically take all the track changes and say, oh, here's our strategy, and not realize that all the inputs are pulling you off the strategic course. And that was their beef around a lot of the Iraq stuff at the end. And they would basically say, like, we aren't doing real strategic thinking, because in a bureaucracy where everybody has their view and where you stand depends on where you sit, the inputs into the strategy go in there. And unless you have a real jerk who's willing to go through there and be like, no, doesn't fit. No, it doesn't fit. no, and I'm willing to fight to the end to cut this out, it'll all end up in there. And what you get is a strategic model. And more times than not, getting into stuff we've talked about, like there's a tendency to just be like, oh, I'll just accept all the changes because then it's approved, right? And I don't have any more beef because everybody's got to have their say in the document. But the end is like, in my case, shitty speeches. But in strategy case, terrible strategies.
The sort of dynamic you talked about earlier of like this whole enterprise of the National Security Council, part of it is just to get everyone on board and, rowing in the right direction. But if you don't do the painful part of saying no to people and having all these fights, and, making sure that, you're not doing two things that are diametrically opposed to each other, then you end up with this sort of like really ugly, mushy decision by committee. Like here's like 47 bullet points that don't add up to anything.
No, I mean, and it's, there's the path of least resistance. And, honestly, track changes it makes it a lot easier because you don't even have to retype it, right? Like, it's just like it all goes in there. And great, I just have to hit one button and it's done. And in theory, you all agree with it. And, but it's junk. I mean, listen, I'm sure some of your listeners, I'm sure you have read national security strategies of recent vintage. And that's what those things are. They've been track changed to death. Like it's just like, I got to get this word in here. And that word ends up in there and it makes no sense. Like they are brutal documents. They're the results of the process, which is like everybody gets to have their say. And there's an incentive not to say no. I would give feedback and I'd be like, this is bullshit. And I got help from colleagues, and that's life. But and I'm like no master strategist or master speechwriter, but it was like, I'm just going to say no because I don't think it adds up. But it's hard. Saying no in government's hard. Saying yes in government's pretty easy.
Any closing recommendations, John? Books? I don't know, some like weird lateral book that like has interesting implications for national security organization and decision making?
My view on this stuff is like read the stuff about and I'm not the first person to say this, but like read novels about power, read novels about, democracy, read these things that are about this. Like I think Elliot Cohen's book that's out now, his Shakespeare book, is like a great book to kind of understand what it's like to be around people who are interested in power. And that is a pretty good indication of like, read the things that make you like reading a book, honestly, reading my book will not help you understand like what these people are like who go into these jobs. Like it would, but it's like, there are other ways to do that are more interesting. That'll probably train your brain in a different way. And like Eliot's book on Shakespeare or just reading the Shakespeare, like just being like getting power, getting the folly of it. And I think that is one of those perspectives. Like you have to have a degree of sense of humor about this world to be like, to kind of get the absurdity of it, and like the belief that like if I go to bed in the next hour, the world could end. That's an absurd thing to think, but there are a lot of people in Washington that think that right now, right? And that's an absurd thing to do. But like having that perspective is the only way I think to read this stuff and be like, because I think you can have the distance to be like, to not take on face value the belief that if I have to be in this seat or the world's going to end, because the fact is that's probably not true.
Yeah,
the number of people who thought that in history is true, and the world keeps going.
It is, but it isn't, John. The world might not end, but like people could die, and people do end up dying based on the decisions that are happening. And then there's sort of the question of like, am I so much better than the next person in the job, or is my marginal extra hour and is my trade-off of like worse decision making because I have worse sleep versus the extra, I'm smarter because I got 6 hours instead of 5. Like, but I do think it's like the case is pretty clear that like, life and death decisions happen in these.
For sure. But they do happen.
Yeah.
But I think the question I would say is that it's big government.
Yeah.
Right. And there's a lot of people like, there are shifts for a reason. There the next guy or the next woman will come in. They're like, there would be somebody else who would have the same incentives and disincentives sitting in that desk if you weren't there.
Yeah.
Like you are making, and I mean this insensitive, like lots of things get done on the margins, but like this idea that like any one of these people is essential to like the end, like Americans' future, America's past. Like it's a big world, it's big government, it's a long cycle. And so that piece I would say, like, yes, there are life and death decisions, but like there is, I think, a degree of believing that I have to sit here and like, listen, that makes you less likely to be good tomorrow. So I just think it's like one of those ones where it's like, you don't know when history is going to show up. And I think this tendency to like say, I got to make it is a very, I get it. But I also think it is a impulse to fight, or at least to keep in mind. And I think that is one thing that if I was hoping anything, like I find very interesting. I wrote a book that has maybe cast a shadow on the National Security Council as a career thing. It's like, maybe this isn't the best place you could sit, right? Like, most people have sat there and had, they screwed up as much as they've succeeded. But it's like fascinating because like the number of emails, I mean, I still get emails about this book. I still get tweets, whatever, X's or whatever, posts or whatever. Like, the 9 out of 10 times that some young person is like, I want to go work on the NSC. What do I have to do? And I'm like, what? Like, I just wrote this book. And it's like, I don't, what are you doing here? Why would that be? Why would you reach out to me? Like, I'm like, you want me to encourage you? So but I do think this point of it is, that's sort of fascinating, which is like, there's a tendency about getting it and there's a tendency about doing it. And, if I was telling a young person is like, get ready to be there and have the right perspective. And the right perspective is, it's a big world. I have so much control, and, that little things can do as much as let's go big. And if you do little things every day, you can change things in a really interesting way. And I think that having that perspective would make a very interesting NSC staffer. Maybe not one that makes the book, but maybe that's not a bad thing.
Yeah. I want to close with a tweet by Marco Jukic of Bismarck Analysis, who said that the elite is not shadowy or mysterious. America is ruled by a technocratic, lanky, Gen X Ivy League white guy archetype who just flies under the radar. White Ivy League, I think, kind of speaks for itself. But what's with the lanky? Like, everyone like runs marathons and is skinny nowadays. Like, did you used to see more paunches back in the day? Like, what's sort of the body type evolution of the NSC staffer been over time?
I mean, I the body type. So I think the first thing is I'd say is like, literally, aside from the Gen X, literally that tweet could have been sent any time between 1947 and today, and probably would have been appropriate. In terms of the lanky, I think it's like a little bit of youth, right? Like it's like you don't have that, and I would say like there's a difference between when they start and when they end. So I think the body type is, you fit in Brooks Brothers. That's pretty much the body type. And, that is to say there's a much more diverse NSC than it was 60 years ago, for sure, right? That said, I think it's still a very bizarre place because most people tend to think very similarly along the same lines, which is what is truly amazing. And that is the piece that I think is the most impactful thing, is that they all went to the same schools in most cases, and I think.
Is there a particular, maybe we'll play some like Nixon Kissinger back and forth. Is there a particular one you're a fan of?
When it comes to Nixon and Kissinger, I can't say I have any favorites, in the sense that I didn't particularly, as I said earlier, enjoy my deep dive into the sort of psychodrama that played out between them and around them. But I think they are, I think, if for nothing else, the most sort of raw, sort of unfiltered way to really understand the thinking and the interplay between those two complicated, combustible and in some ways damaged individuals. I think recordings themselves, they are not Richard Nixon wasn't the first president to sort of record calls, nor was Henry Kissinger the first person to sort of have what he did, which was he did a lot of memorandums of conversations that his aides would sort of type up as he was going along in his calls. And he did a lot of phone calls. So, when you go to the archives, the Nixon archives out in California, you just spend hours going through these memorandum of telephone conversations. They're just amazing, almost minute by minute sort of ways to sort of see his thinking and how he was trying to influence the thinkings of others. Because Kissinger was an incredibly persuasive, his ambition was so strong, and he was always trying to convince people he was sort of right. There's lots of these conversations. You can sort of Google them on YouTube and everything else, and you can get to them when you're, some of them are on the Nixon Library website. You can get to them when you're out there. The one that I think has gotten some attention, but I also think is just a great teaching tool and a great sort of way to sort of see what it must be like to sit in the White House is a recording from December of 1972. So, set stage. Nixon had just won re-election, resoundingly. He had just had Kissinger and the North Vietnamese delegation had been negotiating in Paris for a while. It had come to some sort of final terms, clear that we were making progress. It was pretty clear the United States was getting out of Vietnam at that point, and they were negotiating a deal. And, talks broke down, and Nixon and Kissinger and others decided to sort of unleash what became known as Operation Linebacker, that later became known as the Christmas bombings in December of 1972, to try and, they issued an ultimatum, and then they were hoping the bombings would drive the Chinese to accept their terms and come back to the negotiating table and all these things. And so this recording is really them as they're trying to think through how this whole thing will play out. And you just see this sort of hubris. You see this sort of worldview from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue and the Oval Office in particular, what it was like to sit there. And you see them sort of trying to rationalize what was a barbaric move in retrospect as this sort of move of strategic genius. And they really did, I think that they were, really the geniuses at play here. And so you see it all and you hear it all in this recording. You can just palpably feel it. And what makes it such a great recording, and what the irony of it is, of course, Nixon and to some extent Kissinger didn't trust anybody, right? So they were doing this in part because they wanted to have these recordings so that they would have the knowledge of not only what they said, but what others said. And they also thought that history would look fondly upon them. So they didn't trust historians to tell the truth. They didn't trust journalists to tell the truth. They didn't trust their colleagues to tell the truth. So these recordings were about that. And what's the best part about it is they record their strategic thinking in raw terms, right? And you can hear it on the tape. But then the best part about it is, of course, decades pass, and what became very clear is that, as I think become clear, is the actual impact of these barbaric bombings, in which American forces dropped just 20,000 tons by some estimates, killed almost 1,600 people, civilians. Just a ridiculous bombing, Hanoi, Haiphong, and all these sorts of things. And what ends up happening is that most historians would say maybe it had some level of impact, but at the end of the day, and eventually the North Vietnamese returned to the negotiating table, and there probably is some argument to be made that the bombings drove them back to the negotiating table. But at the end of the day, they were basically accepting, as one American diplomat later said, they were basically forcing them back to the table to accept our concessions. So it sort of shows you not just the sort of the hubris that can happen when you sit there in the Oval Office, that you're really driving events, but also just kind of the sort of the preciousness of thinking that strategy can be determined and really finely tuned to deliver these results. Because the long-term implications of the war were very clear by then. And what this really probably was just an just a sort of outburst of frustration, anger, and attempts to sort of save face by Nixon, Kissinger, and others. And you can sort of hear it all in the tape. So it's a really valuable document. One of the few pieces you can really imagine and really get a glimpse of what it's like to sit in the White House. And so it's a great one to teach. It's a great one to listen to, and a great one that will probably haunt you, or at least you'll remember. Your listeners will remember for years.
But we're not going to be impotent under these circumstances. At a time they are building up, see, the rationale for the bombing act must be a build-up in the North. Just say that. Christ, everybody's going to think it. It's true. It's true. They restored the goddamn power plants, all right? So we're bombing the North again because they're building up the North.
No, they have the biggest, that's another thing, Mr. President. They have the biggest infiltration, a bigger one than last year, going on right now.
I'm not worried about that at the moment. I mean, that's true. But wait, but my point is about going into infiltration and the rest of it. I just say, because we do, there's a big enemy build up on the war, and they're trying to trick us, so we're going to bomb. We'll take the heat right over the Christmas period, and then in January, it's prisoners who withdraw.
The other side was practically on their knees in October. They've never had gone as far as they did. It is not a bad agreement. It's a good agreement if it's observed. If it's observed, the other side will be forced to withdraw. What we have to do, though, is to convince them that we are not easily pushed around. If we cave now, the agreement will be unenforceable, and we will have signed something that the government will make.
Well, remember, we're going to be around